There were claw marks on the inside of the bedroom door. Not scratches from an animal, not the kind left by panic in a dream. These had purpose. 4 parallel gudges carved deep into the wood, each one ending in a splintered crescent where a fingernail had torn away. When the deputies finally pried it open, they found the room empty, the bed stripped bare, and a single photograph nailed to the wall. A woman and a boy, hand in hand, looking not at the camera, but at each other, eyes fixed, almost trembling with recognition. Someone had scrawled a date beneath it in red ink, March 14th, 1967. The floorboards were warped from years of moisture, but they still carried the faint smell of rot and cheap perfume. A cracked mirror leaned against the dresser, reflecting nothing but the slow crawl of daylight through torn curtains. On the windowsill, they found strands of hair, some dark, some pale, twisted together as though someone had been braiding them in the dark. And near the foot of the bed, a child's rattle, melted, blackened at the edges, as if it had been held too close to flame. The neighbors said the scream started just before sunrise. One long, thin wail that didn't sound like it came from a human throat. It echoed through the hills, carrying across the valley where fog clung low and thick over the river. By the time anyone was brave enough to come to the house, the noise had stopped. No one went inside right away. They waited. The sun rose, the mist thinned, and only then did someone step forward. What they found inside that rotting Kentucky farmhouse would become one of the most disturbing cases in American history. A story whispered about for decades, erased from newspapers, sealed in archives, and yet somehow still alive in the mouths of those who remember. There are still people who say the house never really burned down, that if you walk far enough into the woods where it once stood, you'll find the stone steps leading nowhere. And if you listen carefully, if the wind is still and the ground is wet, you might hear it again, that long, drawn-out cry of something trying to be born or trying to die. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story about forbidden love. It's about what happens when a family forgets what love is. When blood turns inward and names disappear into the same grave. The place was called Fett County, though old records spell it differently. Fett. Fett, sometimes Fett's Hollow, as if even the land itself tried to hide its name. It lay deep in the folds of eastern Kentucky, a stretch of valley carved by time and coal dust, where the air always seemed damp, and the earth never forgot what was buried in it. The population never broke a few thousand. Most of them were descendants of the same 5 families who had settled there in the late 1800s, drawn by the promise of coal seams and the quiet safety of isolation. There were no paved roads until the 1950s. No hospital within 30 miles. A single church stood on the hill, its bell long rusted. Its preacher rumored to have gone mad after finding bones under the altar during a spring flood. The cemetery behind it stretched into the woods, unmarked stones leaning in on one another like gossiping elders. And in that soil lay a name that would one day stain the county's history: Mays. The Mays family had lived in Fett County since the mines were first dug. They were known for keeping to themselves, marrying within their own, and distrusting anyone from off the hill. There were whispers, quiet ones, that the Mays blood wasn't right. That children were born with eyes too far apart, with extra fingers, or with voices that never developed past a whisper. The local doctor, before he left, wrote in his notes that something was off in the gene pool, though he used kinder words. After his departure, no one replaced him. Old-timers still talk about the floods of 37, when half the town was washed away and the Mays homestead stood untouched at the edge of the river. Some say the water curved around their property, like it was afraid to touch it. Others say it wasn't fear at all, but recognition, as if the river knew that whatever lived there had already drowned long ago. Barbara Jean Mays was born into that mud and silence in 1929. Her birth certificate, what little exists of it, is smeared by moisture and coal dust. Her parents were cousins, not a rumor, but a fact written in courthouse ink. Her grandparents shared a bloodline twice over. By the time Barbara came into the world, the Mays family tree had long stopped branching outward. It folded in on itself like a dying vine. She grew up in a shack with no running water, no books, no visitors. Her father was a miner who drank himself blind. Her mother was a figure of quiet despair, a body present but a mind long gone. Barbara was the fourth of 8 children, though 2 died before they could walk. It's said that one of her brothers spoke in tongues. Another tore his own teeth out by the age of 10. No one called doctors. They called it the family way. By the time Barbara turned 14, she had already learned that love came with bruises, and that silence was the only language anyone in that house truly spoke. The mountains kept their secrets, but not forever. By the time Barbara reached 16, her face had hardened into something far older than her years. Eyes too knowing, mouth set in a permanent half-frown, like she'd already seen the worst the world could offer. She ran away before the first frost, leaving behind the family shack and the echo of her father's cough. No one stopped her. In Fett County, when someone disappeared, you didn't ask where they'd gone. You just waited for the land to reclaim their name. She found work in diners and truck stops, serving men who smelled of gasoline and loneliness. None of them asked her age. None of them asked her name twice. For a brief while, she followed a drifter north, a man with a missing tooth and a soft voice who promised her Ohio. He abandoned her outside Charleston, West Virginia, in a truck stop bathroom that stank of bleach and cheap whiskey. She was 3 months pregnant. She gave birth to a boy in the county hospital, a charity ward with flickering lights and nurses who never spoke above a whisper. She named him James. For 12 minutes after the birth, she held him against her chest, tracing his tiny fingers with trembling hands. Then she left. No goodbye, no note, no name left for the records. The nurses said she walked out barefoot into the winter rain and never came back. James Hoskins was raised by strangers, shuffled between foster homes where kindness was rationed and cruelty was routine. He grew quiet, distrustful, and old before his time. He never knew his mother's name, only the hospital note that said she was unfit for care. When he asked about her, the social workers told him not to dig. But James did dig. He carried that question with him like a wound. Why did she leave me? 16 years later, in the spring of 1966, an envelope arrived at Barbara's trailer in Lexington. Inside was a letter written by a state social worker, polite, professional, hopeful. "Your son has been looking for you," it said. "He wants to meet." By then, Barbara was living alone, worn down by years of bad men and cheaper liquor. Her hair was thin, her hands shook, her teeth were yellow from cigarettes. She read that letter again and again, tracing her own name with a trembling thumb. Something inside her, something that had been asleep for decades, stirred. When she saw him for the first time, in a diner off Route 60, she said it was like looking into a mirror. He had her eyes, her father's jaw, and the same haunted stillness that had clung to every Mays child before him. He smiled when he saw her. He cried when she hugged him. And Barbara said later that in that moment, something broke open inside her, not maternal love, not relief, but something older, hungrier, and wrong. Those who believe in curses say that was the moment it awakened again. The old sickness buried in the May's blood. It just needed time and a perfect mirror to find its shape. They began meeting in secret. At first, it was innocent. Lunches at diners, walks by the river. Letters exchanged between their meetings, as if time itself couldn't move fast enough. She told him stories of his childhood that weren't true, memories borrowed from her siblings or stolen from dreams. She said he had loved music as a baby, that he used to laugh in his sleep. She said he was born under a full moon, and that the nurse had whispered he'd been touched by something old. James listened and believed every word. He wanted to believe. Within months, the meetings became daily. She moved him into her trailer on the outskirts of Lexington, introducing him to neighbors as her nephew. He slept in the small room by the kitchen, where wallpaper peeled from the damp and the ceiling leaked when it rained. Barbara began cooking for him, brushing his hair, washing his shirts by hand, even when the laundromat was open. There was something ritualistic in the way she cared for him. A mother's tenderness poisoned by need. James didn't question it. He had been passed between too many houses, too many strangers. When Barbara said, "You belong here," he believed her. When she told him that the world outside would never understand what they had, he believed that too. It wasn't long before they stopped using words like mother and son. They began using we instead. Neighbors started whispering. A woman down the road, Dolores Finch, told her husband that something about the boy's eyes made her uneasy. She said he looked at Barbara not like a son, but like a man looking at a woman he couldn't have. The husband told her to stop gossiping. "They keep to themselves," he said. "Ain't our business." But behind those thin trailer walls, the air grew heavy. James had nightmares that left him shaking and drenched in sweat. He said he saw a woman standing at the foot of his bed. Sometimes Barbara, sometimes someone else, whispering in a voice that wasn't hers. "You're mine," she would say. "You've always been mine." Barbara claimed she never heard a thing. In January of 1967, the temperature dropped below freezing. That was the night everything changed. Barbara would later say James came to her. James would later claim she called him to her room. Either way, what happened in that trailer defied sense. It wasn't love. It wasn't lust. It was something deeper, a collapse of boundaries older than they were. It was as if the curse that had been festering in their blood for generations had finally found its vessel. When the morning came, Barbara told him the truth. That she was his mother. That their blood was one. That what they had done could never be spoken aloud because it was sacred. Their secret, their bond. And James, half broken from hunger for belonging, didn't run. He simply nodded. 3 months later, they stood in front of a courthouse clerk and signed a marriage license. She lied about his age. She lied about their names. The woman behind the desk stamped the paper without looking up. In the photograph taken that day, Barbara is smiling for the first time in her life. James is not. His hand in hers looks limp, like he's already gone somewhere she can't follow. They moved east, away from Lexington's curious eyes, to a fading mining town near Ashland. A place where no one asked questions because everyone had ghosts of their own. The neighbors assumed Barbara was an older wife clinging to her younger husband. Their home was a sagging clapboard house with mildew creeping up the walls, and a porch that swayed when the wind breathed through it. Inside, the air was heavy, still as if time refused to move. Barbara filled the rooms with hand-me-down furniture and lace curtains that yellowed within months. James found work briefly at a scrapyard, but he came home quieter each night, his hands blackened with oil and something darker he couldn't name. He rarely slept. When he did, the dreams returned. He would wake gasping, eyes wild, convinced there was someone else in the room, standing just beyond the doorway, watching. Once, he described her to Barbara in the trembling hours before dawn. Her hair was wet. She smelled like earth. And she whispered, "Make it right this time." Barbara only smiled, brushing his hair from his forehead. "She's just family," she said softly. "They're only watching to be sure we don't forget them." By then, the isolation had grown thick enough to breathe in. James stopped leaving the house. Barbara began keeping the curtains drawn, even during the day. The mailman said the windows were always dark, even when the lamps were on inside. Some nights, the neighbors swore they heard chanting, a low, rhythmic murmur that rose and fell with the wind. A local priest was called once. He came to the door with a Bible and left within 5 minutes, pale as chalk, muttering that the smell in the house was not of this earth. After that, no one else tried to visit. It was the spring of 1970 when Barbara told James she was pregnant. The doctor in Ashland refused to believe it. She was 41, frail, malnourished. But the swelling was real, the heartbeat undeniable. The child grew fast, too fast. By the 5th month, Barbara could barely walk. She said the baby kicked in patterns. 3 quick, 1 slow, 3 again, as if it were trying to speak through her body. James grew more distant as her belly grew. He began keeping a journal, though he never let her read it. The few lines later recovered from that notebook are fragmented. Frantic. It watches me through her skin. Her voice isn't hers anymore. The house hums when she sleeps. Barbara gave birth on an August night without doctors, without witnesses. The neighbors claimed they heard no screams, only the sound of wind moving through the trees like a sigh. When dawn came, Barbara stood in the yard holding a blanket. Her face was blank, her eyes distant. A neighbor passing on the road asked, "Is the baby all right?" Barbara looked at her for a long time before answering. "It's not a baby," she said. "It's a remembrance." The neighbor never saw the child. No one did. A week later, James Hoskins was found wandering the woods 3 miles away, barefoot, covered in mud, whispering to himself. He was taken into custody after confessing to something no one could make sense of. I tried to bury it, but it kept breathing. Barbara was never seen again. When the deputies entered the house, they said it smelled like rust and wet clay, like the inside of a grave after rain. There were no lights on, but every mirror in the house had been covered with bedsheets, pinned tight like shrouds. The kitchen table was still set for 2. A half-eaten meal sat on the plates, black with mold, and a single glass of milk stood untouched beside a wilted bouquet of wildflowers. They found symbols scratched into the walls, circles within circles, spirals drawn in ash, and words that looked like they had been written backward. On the floor of the bedroom, where the bed had been dragged aside, they found a ring of salt broken clean through in one spot, as if something had stepped out. And in the middle of the room, a shallow depression in the floorboards, shaped like something had been lying there for a long time. The officers didn't linger. They collected James's journal, a handful of letters, and photographs of Barbara from decades before. But no trace of her body, no sign of a child. Just the lingering odor and a low, humming vibration in the walls that one officer swore he could feel through his boots. When James was questioned, he didn't resist. He just sat in silence, hands folded, eyes unfocused. For hours, he said nothing. Then, near dawn, his voice broke through the quiet, low, tired, almost reverent. It wasn't her that left the house. It was what wore her. He spoke of the night the baby was born, though his version sounded less like a birth and more like a summoning. He said the air grew heavy, that the lamps flickered blue, that Barbara began whispering names he didn't recognize. Names that made the glass shake and the floorboards bend. And then she went still. He said the room filled with the smell of iron, and from her mouth came a sound. Not crying, not screaming, but something older, something remembering itself. He saw hands where no hands should be. He saw something crawl out of her, not onto the bed, but into the floorboards. When the sheriff asked what he meant, James only said, "It wasn't supposed to stay. It was supposed to go back. But it looked at me." Within 2 weeks, James Hoskins was moved to the state hospital in Louisville. He would spend the rest of his life there. Doctors diagnosed him with schizophrenia, but the nurses whispered that sometimes, late at night, when the halls went quiet, he would hum the same rhythm over and over. 3 quick, 1 slow, 3 again. In 1985, long after his death, state officials ordered the demolition of the old house in Ashland. The work crew refused to finish. The foreman reported that every time they tried to bring down the walls, the machinery would stall. Tools broke, engines failed. Finally, one worker pried up the floorboards in the back room and found what the sheriff had missed 15 years earlier. Not a skeleton, not a body, but a cocoon, long-sinewed, dried to leather. Inside it, curled tight, was something shaped like a child. Its skin was translucent, its eyes sealed shut, and yet, when sunlight hit it, one worker swore he saw it move. By the time investigators arrived, the cocoon was gone. Only the floor remained, wet, though it hadn't rained in weeks. The house was burned that night, without permission. Locals still say, if you drive that road after dark, your headlights will dim for a few seconds as you pass the clearing. The air goes colder. The smell of rust and wet earth returns. And if you listen close enough, you might hear a soft hum under your tires. 3 quick, 1 slow, 3 again. They say that's the heartbeat of what never died, and what never should have been born. For decades, the story was buried. The case file on Barbara Mays and James Hoskins sits in the Fayette County Archives, misfiled under Missing Persons. The folder smells faintly of mildew, and half the pages are gone. But what remains reads less like evidence and more like a haunting. Handwritten notes, half-erased statements, fragments of something no official language could name. The doctor who treated James in his final years, a man named Dr. Harlan, wrote an entry that was never meant for public eyes. He speaks of her as if she's still in the room, says she visits him in the mirror, says the thing born between them was not a child, but a doorway. He insists that when he dies, she will come to collect what remains. James died in 1982. The nurses who prepared his body said his eyes were open, fixed on something above the bed, and that his lips were curled, not in fear, but in recognition. His final words, written shakily on a torn napkin, were just 3. She's coming home. The state buried him in an unmarked grave, but a month later, the grass around his plot began to die in a perfect circle, as if something beneath the soil was leeching life upward. Within a year, the cemetery groundskeeper quit, refusing to return even during the day. He said the earth there moved. In the years since, strange things have happened in that region. Children born with birthmarks shaped like spirals, cats disappearing for days, returning slick with river mud though the nearest water lies miles away. And in 2006, a family who bought land near the old Maze property found that their newborn spoke its first word before it ever cried. The word, the mother said, wasn't English. It wasn't anything she could place. But when she tried to describe the sound to a historian from Lexington, he froze. He said the word appeared in a forgotten Appalachian text, a phonetic echo of an archaic ritual once used by mountain settlers to call the blood back home. They moved away within the month. Today, Fett County is nearly empty. The coal mines have caved in, the church has no preacher, and the hill where the Maze home once stood is fenced off by the state, labeled a soil contamination zone. No one who's gone beyond the fence has stayed long enough to report what's really there. But locals still talk about it. On quiet nights, when the mist drifts low and the air tastes metallic, they swear they see light moving beneath the ground. A soft, pulsing glow that keeps time like a heartbeat. And if you wait long enough, they say, you can hear it humming. 3 quick, 1 slow, 3 again. The rhythm of a curse. The breath of a bloodline that refused to die. The sound of a mother calling her child home from the other side of the dirt. And somewhere, beneath that hill, something answers, something that remembers, something that never stopped growing, something that's still waiting for the rest of its family to come back. End.